we, on a regular basis, along with community foundations across the country, produce a report called Vital Signs. And I should start by acknowledging the leadership of Grace Diffie in my shop and of Dr. Leela Ryan, who's sitting inconspicuously in the third row. Leela has been our advisory committee chair that assemble a panel of subject experts to look at the data, the demographics, and the changes that are happening. And that report really is something that attempts to engage community on critical issues affecting the broader region. And last year we produced an update based on the most recent census of 10 key categories, everything from the arts and the environment to healthcare and poverty in the state of neighborhoods. Today we're releasing our first update to that report, and it is focused on seniors in this community. And I'm going to, at the start, turn it over to Jeff Wingard, who was the lead researcher on this project. Then I'm going to invite our two expert panelists, Jim Dunn and Anju Joshi, to join us. We'll engage them with a couple of softball questions that I'll lob to them, and then we'll turn it over to you for the hardball questions, the heckling, and whatever else you think is appropriate for our guest speakers. What we always attempt to do is engage, provoke, challenge, and have people think about how each of us can make a difference in the life and the trajectory of our communities. So let me tell you just briefly about Jeff. He is an extraordinary researcher with 20 years of experience. He's done projects like the McMaster Poverty Initiative. He's worked on the Abacus Educational Initiative for us. He's worked on the City's Neighborhoods Project. He's from Indiana, which would make you want to believe that he's an extraordinary basketball player. I can tell you that sadly that's one area in which Norm hockey doesn't quite meet the grade when it comes to that, because we play in a little beer league basketball game about 3 blocks from right here every Monday night. Our most famous fellow basketball players are the Arkells, so yeah. For music junkies, I'm not sure why I'm telling you that, other than I'm running the clock before I turn it over to Jeff to acknowledge him for his leadership and expertise, but also to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of the findings relative to seniors and vital signs in Hamilton. Jeff Wingard.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you, Terry. Wow, I got loud on the way up here. It's a privilege to be here with you today. I want to take just a couple of moments to run through the highlights of the 4-pager that you have on your chairs there. That's kind of the summary version. There's an expanded version on the web that will have some more information, the sources where we got the data, some additional tables and explanation there. So if you take a look there at the 4-pager and you have some questions, there might be some more information on the web. I wanted just to expand a little bit on what Terry said about the Vital Signs full report, which we published last spring at this time. These are the subject areas that we work with the advisory committee to identify indicators for. And as Terry mentioned, this is a really broad-ranging report, which is one of the fun things about it for a researcher. We get to look at different areas like the environment, like arts and culture, the economy, poverty, health, which is a rarity. Often when we do these reports, we kind of delve into to a rabbit hole of one particular area, but this one gives us a bit of an opportunity to look across and get a snapshot of what are the bigger things that are happening in Hamilton and where are the potential trouble spots or areas of celebration for our community to focus in on. So we work with our advisors for each of these subject areas to kind of determine indicators that we want to look at, numbers that both reflect, that will reflect change, that will do justice to the kind of trends that we know are happening in Hamilton. And then we asked them as a follow-up, we said, we do this broad-ranging report. We'd like to focus in on some issues over the coming year. And one of the first areas we thought we wanted to focus in on was on the issue of seniors in Hamilton. And we chose to look in 4 areas. Part of this was because we thought these were really key areas for seniors in Hamilton. Part of it is because we had recent information from the census and from the Canadian Community Health Survey that helps us tell the story, that we know is really reliable data and really validated data. So those are the areas that we're going to kind of go through this afternoon. So one of the things that we ask our advisory committee to do under Leela's guidance is to help us identify statistics or variables that measure change in three ways. One is over time, so are we getting better or worse over time? How do we compare? The second way is how do we compare to provincial and national averages? So is Hamilton kind of better off or worse off than what's happening in Ontario and Canada? And then the third way is what we call disparity measures. And that just means, are there groups that do better or worse, or neighborhoods who do better or worse on one indicator? One example of that would be the poverty rates in Code Red. So we know that the poverty rate in Hamilton is, say, 18%. We know that there are neighborhoods where it's well over 50%, neighborhoods where it's less than 5%. And so it just means that we have to delve a little deeper into some of these variables to see really what's happening in Hamilton. So with no further ado, so when we look at just numbers of seniors and how the landscape has changed a bit in the last decade, number of seniors has increased by 23%. That's compared to an overall growth rate in Hamilton of 6.4%. So the numbers of seniors, those over 65, are growing at about 4 times the rate of the rest of the population in Hamilton. Number of seniors over 85 increased 55%. So that's 8 times the general population growth. Women make up the majority of seniors over 65, and almost 2/3 of those over 85. But men are catching up, trying to catch up. Men over 85, fastest growing group of seniors, and that's about 9 times the rate of the general population growth. So seniors are certainly living longer, and it's growing at much faster than the general population in Hamilton. When we looked at diversity, we looked at 3 different areas. We looked at country of birth. We looked at some statistics around Indigenous seniors, and we looked at seniors who identify as visible minorities. Seniors in Hamilton are quite diverse in terms of country of birth. Half were born outside of Canada. Now, the vast majority of those were European, and if you're interested, the top 10 are on the web, but I'll give you a spoiler. Italy was the most common, and that's 9% of seniors. UK was number 2 with 8%. And then when we looked at then there were a couple, Croatia, Germany, and the Netherlands were all about 2%. So those are the countries that many of the current seniors come from. Number of seniors born in Asian countries has increased from 9 to 14% and will continue to increase when we look at the age cohorts building up to seniors. So those numbers are going up. You see 9 to 14% over the last decade. In the last census, we saw more seniors, about double the number of seniors reporting some kind of Aboriginal ancestry. So if there are any data geeks out in the audience, you will know that census data is really tough when looking at Indigenous Canadians for a whole host of reasons. The Six Nations Reserve does not fill out the census, and many Indigenous Canadians, because of the history of colonization and residential schools, are very reluctant to get involved in that. So we have limited information. We need to make sure that we treat this with caution. But the fact that we're seeing some increase there is likely reflective of people answering the question more often than in the past, rather than an influx of new Indigenous Canadians in Hamilton. 9% of seniors identify as visible minorities. That's compared to 19% in the general population. But this number is also increasing, and we expect it to continue growing. When we look at the younger part of the seniors, 65 to 74, the number is about 11%, 10.5% to 11%. And so it will continue to track upwards. In terms of health, we looked at a couple of issues. Physical health, mental health, obesity, sense of belonging, and then kind of some look at healthcare provision. You'll see that, and in most cases, we really reflect provincial averages in this regard. We don't vary very much at all from provincial averages, but you'll see that this is that fewer than half of seniors report excellent or very good health. 68, two-thirds, report excellent or good mental health. And this has implications when you think about the growing number of seniors, coupled with fewer than half reporting excellent or good health. The pressure on the healthcare system will feel that. Similar to the general population, obesity is trending up over the past decade, something certainly to pay attention to. We're seeing that in the general population as well, all age groups, including youth and adult. Interesting that the sense of belonging in Hamilton is also trending up. Now this shows some variation from year to year, but when we look at it over the past decade, to see this moving up, people saying, I have a strong or somewhat strong sense of belonging to my local community, and that's where we go. So this is good news for Hamilton. And then finally, Hamilton does very well in terms of linking people to regular healthcare providers and access to care. Part of that is because of where we are near to major healthcare institutions with Hamilton Health Sciences and St. Joe's. But the provincial average for number of seniors with a regular healthcare provider, I think, is around 92% or 93%. So we do much better here. This also varies a bit by neighborhood. And we have, in this particular area, it's one of the best in all of the city of Hamilton. When we looked at housing, I think this was pretty interesting to me as a researcher. 3/4 of seniors own their own home, and by and large, those are single detached homes. And that remains the same regardless of the kind of tenure where you are in terms of your seniorness. So 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85, those who are 85 plus, this number still stays the same, around 3/4 of folks are still owning their own home. And what we know about, we'll get to the seniors living alone, but owning your own home is single detached, as the demands of maintaining that home go up, there'll be some needs to think about how we support folks to stay in their own home should they wish. 25% of seniors rent. Those are, and when we look at where people rent, the folks are largely in buildings with 5 or more stories. So big apartment buildings rather than just single detached rentals. We have a higher than provincial average of folks that live alone. So 23,000 seniors living alone. We know that isolation is one of the big predictors of depression and can have some real deleterious effects on health. And so certainly something to think about. 1/3 of those over 85 are living alone. Women more likely to live alone. And you see that almost 4 out of 5 folks who are over 85 that are living alone are women. In terms of long-term care, there has been some progress in terms of building beds. So in the last 15 years, we've added about 600 long-term care beds. I think we all know that's not enough, but it is a bit of headway, and there have been some announcements about future long-term care. Current waiting list for people not currently in long-term care homes is about 1,000 folks. So there is an internal waiting list if you're already in a long-term care waiting home and looking for another bed. That's about 500. But certainly there is a pent-up demand for that kind of housing. I think this is the last area, in terms of income. So you'll see that we had kind of 2 different stories emerge when we looked at income. So seniors overall, the income is rising faster than the cost of living over the past decade, which is good news for seniors. Median income about $30,000. We wouldn't expect it to be that of the general population. We would expect it to be a little bit lower because often seniors are not working. There's not that income coming in, and we're using savings for that income. One of the things that we need to pay attention to was that after years of improvement, the seniors' poverty rate went up this last census year. We don't know yet if that was a blip or if that was determining a long-term trend. We also saw emergency food bank use increased by seniors. So I was, just before we came today, I was taking a look at what seniors' poverty rates were historically, and in the late 70s, they were 35 to 40%, and in Hamilton. And so one of the things governments this is one of the bright spots, I think, of what governments are able to do if they focus their attention. that they made a concerted effort around guaranteed income supplements and the OAS and a bunch of different policy initiatives to address specifically seniors' poverty that had a really strong effect. And you see now that we're down in the 10% area. We do need to pay attention to this. Obviously, the next bullet is similar to the Code Red findings, that we need, while it's 11% in Hamilton overall, we are at, there are 3 particular neighborhoods that were above. One was at 48%, one was at 54%, and one was at 66%, which speaks to some of the needs that are existing. All 3 of those are in the lower city, but many of them, other neighborhoods are below 5%. So again, when we think about interventions for seniors and income, it's not one size fits all for the city of Hamilton for sure. One of the other interesting things, finally, to wind up, is that more seniors are working. So we saw an increase of almost double over the last 15 years of seniors who are participating in the labor force. We don't have data locally on why that's happening, but we do have some information about why that's happening nationally, and it is happening nationally. Very similar trend line. Increased educational attainment, so people are having more degrees. They're able to work longer in a field of choice. There is improved life expectancy. Those are 2 reasons. And then the third reason is that there are fewer jobs with pensions. And so people are having to stay in jobs longer because they are not linked to work that allows them to retire. And you know, as I read that the first time, I was thinking, oh, this is great. There's a lot of Mac profs that are working past the age of 65. And isn't that terrific? When we look at the occupations where people are working past 65, I just want to give you a sense of what those are. For men, they are managers in agriculture, so that's farming. There's retail trade managers, transport truck drivers, retail sales, janitors, and caretakers. So those didn't exactly fit my picture of who's working longer, not out of choice. For women, it was administrative assistants, managers in agriculture, administrative offices, retail sales, and general office support. So again, these are not folks that are able to leave the labor force and retire comfortably at 65. So I just wanted to wind up there and turn it back over to Terry for introducing the panelists.
I'm not going to quite let you off the hook yet, so please join me in thanking Jeff for that presentation. And before you get to go and sit in the cheap seats, just tell me what surprised you as an experienced researcher. What did you find that stuck out?
So there were a couple things. One was the number of folks that are living alone, and that number is higher than provincial average, and that it's growing. So I think, and the combination of that with staying in single detached homes, I think creates some real service pressures. So that was one. The trends around income were quite surprising to me, because for years we've just been seeing seniors' poverty go down and down and down because of concerted efforts by everybody, and now all of a sudden we have these blips, we hope they're blips, going up in the wrong direction, and we see it with food bank use, and we see it in neighborhoods. So I think those are really concerning trends, coupled with seniors working longer, and it sounds like some of whom are not choosing to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to let Jeff sit down, but when we get into the Q&A session, he's not immune from hard questions. So feel free to toss them in his direction. I'm going to introduce, can I ask Jim and Anju come and join us? Anju, we're going to put you in the middle. Jim on the far left, perhaps a reflection of your politics. I'm not entirely sure.
We're both left of you, Terry.
Indeed, but I'm moving in your direction, let me tell you. Actually, we should also acknowledge there is a wealth of expertise in this audience, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge in the very back row, sitting next to Norman Hawk, Dr. Ronald Bain, who I believe was the... Dr. Bain, stand and be recognized, please. A couple of things you should know about Ronald. First of all, he's an extended part of Anju's family, or vice versa. He was one of the early champions leading the study of gerontology in this region at McMaster, and then as a medical director at St. Pete's, where a long time ago I worked as a housekeeper and a porter in the summers, and actually got to watch him up close and get a sense of his deep commitment to the area that we're talking about today. So I think it's fair to say that he knows as much about this subject as anybody on the panel or anybody else in the audience. But more sadly, he's leaving for the West Coast with his daughter Sarah. They're moving this week. And we're going to miss him very much, and we appreciate everything that you have done for this community. God bless you.
He's trying to get me to cry.
And now, even though these two are both friends, and I know them well, I am going to read this portion because I want to recognize the expertise that they bring to their roles here today. Anju Joshi, first of all, you should know she's a great member of the board of the Hamilton Community Foundation. That's my paid political advertisement. But she's a recently retired associate professor in the Department of Health, Aging, and Society at McMaster. She's got over 33 years of experience working in the fields of gerontology, education, diversity and inclusion, and case management. She's passionate about knowledge exchange and the resources she has brought to bear, used widely by agencies and organizations serving older adults in this community. She's taught a range of courses on aging, disability, long-term care, aging, and society. She was a founding board member of the Hamilton Council on Aging, where she chaired the project designed to improve access to health and social services for diverse populations and seniors in this community. And she is, in addition to being on the Community Foundation board, also presently on the board of Empowerment Squared. Thank you, Anju, for being with us. And Dr. Jim Dunn is a professor in the Department of Health, Aging, and Society at McMaster and a scientist at the Center for Urban Health Solutions at St. Mike's in Toronto. He was recently named the Senator William McMaster Chair in Urban Health Equity at McMaster and has previously been the William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Chair in Canadian Studies at Harvard. That means you do seances and all kinds of other unusual things, if I recall correctly. Okay, so I'm going to toss a couple of softballs, and then we're going to have a moving microphone that will allow each of you to put a question if you're so inclined. The only thing that I would ask, and I'm reflecting on our experience at the SPEC last night, is it's a chance to ask a question to provoke the panelists. And to the extent you want to make a statement or express an opinion, let's try and keep it brief and to the point. So Anju, I'm going to start with you, because there's some good stuff here, for sure. But you've spent your professional career studying the supports that are necessary for seniors to age well. And we know well that both ageism and isolation remain a profound challenge and barrier. So talk to us both about what it means to age well, but also about how do we deal with the barriers that we've just identified.
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, okay. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in the room and the ground level, people who are actually working directly with older adults. So I don't profess to have all the answers. But I think in terms of aging well, having social and physical environments that support older people in a way they want to be supported. So I think oftentimes from all the work that I've done in the community and in our studies is that we tend to make a lot of assumptions about what people want. So Jane Aronson, for example, had done some great research where it showed that a lot of older women were saying, no, I don't want to stay in my own home anymore. I want to go somewhere else someone else can do the cooking, right? So where we kept saying, oh no, everybody wants to stay in their own homes as long as possible. So I think we need to really listen to the voice of people who are experiencing some of the challenges as they age. So the Hamilton Council on Aging has done some really great work in the community in terms of age-friendly communities, but I think they also are planning to do more work with people who are actually quite marginalized. So people who are isolated, or people who, for being racialized and poor. So I think we need to get more information from these folks in order to be able to serve them better. So Renee is here from St. Matthew's House, and they're doing some great work with some very incredibly vulnerable, marginalized seniors. So we need to learn from people who are actually doing the work.
Very good. The supplementary was about ageism and isolation. So I'm going to put you on the spot and just take a minute and talk about both of those things.
Okay. I think ageism continues to be a huge problem in our society, and I think it's not just by individual interactions and how we talk with older people or how we address them, but it's also in our policy making, in the way we talk about this aging silver tsunami as if they're going to be destructive force in our society. So there's a lot of language used that really implies that it's a problem. So we don't talk about aging in terms of to celebrate, that it's something to celebrate, that the fact from our data that more men are living over the age of 85 is actually something to celebrate. So we shouldn't be looking at it as a problem, to solve. So I think, yes, ageism continues to be a huge issue. And I think if you think about then it intersecting with other identities, so people who have a disability, somebody who's poor, somebody who's racialized, and then they experience ageism as well as some of the other isms, it actually leads to a lot of barriers for them to participate in society. And isolation, again, we are studying, so Rachel Weldrick's here, who's doing her PhD in isolation in seniors. So McMaster is doing lots of work on isolation, and Hamilton Council on Aging is also doing work in the issue of isolation. At the same time, I think we still are nowhere near addressing the issue of isolation of people who are already marginalized in so many ways. So, and then in the mainstream, I'd say there's a lot of caregivers who are very isolated, and we don't provide enough support for them. So it's not just people who have marginalized identities, but I'd say caregivers are also very isolated. So.
Thank you. I'm just going to be mindful of my back because I realize I'm trying to be seen and heard by the entire audience. One of the points that Jeff made in his presentation was the extent to which public policy can make a profound difference in the lives of different parts of our community, and particularly with respect to income security. We've certainly seen that movement since the 70s to the present time with respect to seniors living in deep poverty. My question to you, Jim, and before I put the question, I'm reminded that we should acknowledge and recognize the important role that the SPEC has played in so much of both bringing the story of Code Red and of vital signs to the community, and of really committing deeply to investigative journalism that really exposes the impact of things like poverty by postal code in the community and its effects on health and educational outcomes. But to you, my question is, the extraordinary growth of the 85 plus portion of the population and the reality that many of those people are not driving has real implications for something that you've spent some time advising governments on, which is how do you design communities, how do you design streets and walkable places and transit systems that in fact work for entire communities. Can you just talk a little bit about what this means to decision makers and policy makers in terms of what we need to be focused on?
Yeah,
Fire
absolutely. And I think it will amplify some of the things that Anju said, which is that, we're seeing this growth in older populations, and that is going to continue. And in fact, it's going to accelerate. So the front edge of the baby boom is about 70 right now. And so the population over the age of 80, and that's the age at which you have to start proving your readiness and ability to drive, is going to grow very rapidly in about a decade. And so this is definitely a planning issue that we need to be cognizant of, because it will be challenging to provide taxi service. And lots of people think, okay, well, Uber's going to save us and driverless cars and so forth. And I think that's a fairly wishful thinking kind of approach. We ought to have at least a backup plan for that, in my view. And so, to my mind, it actually goes to something else that Anju said, which is that there's a relative lack of choice, right? So, in terms of housing options, and because the housing option that you choose, with it, you also are choosing a number of transportation options. And if we can have more transit-friendly, transit-oriented housing options that are accessible, affordable, and trusted pathways to get there, then we are going to have more options for people. So it's not to say that anybody has to do anything. And and this is a good example. It also allows people to stay in their communities. So a good example here is these buildings that we can all see around us are infill essentially from the community of Dundas, which Dundas has been primarily a single detached community over its history, but now we're seeing a relative increase of more transit-friendly and transit-oriented housing that allows people to make choices that doesn't necessarily mean they have to leave their own community. And the more that we can do that, the better off we'll be. I would also suggest to you that the LRT offers a huge opportunity in this regard for the future of Hamilton. So if we go out to the east of Hamilton, we've got many, many people who are living in single detached homes. We've got an aging population. Many of those people are sitting on 8% annual increases in the value of their properties over a period of time, but they are at risk of being house rich and cash poor. And we may have an opportunity, I think, with some of the transit nodes to build something age-friendly and even age-optimizing. And in fact, we might even entertain an inquiry about what would an age-optimizing neighborhood look like. You know, top of the list for me would be transit access. Next on the list would be, you know, maybe more aggressive snow removal, if not actual heating of the sidewalks, for instance. Enhanced safety and so forth. And basically just to give people more trusted environments, and then also how do we get people for those pathways from the home that they may have lived in for many decades into something that is going to be safe and affordable, and also allow them to continue to live in their own neighborhood and really exercise as much choice as possible. And we haven't had as much pressure, I think, for being able to create all those choices as we had in the past, but that's certainly coming.
So supplementary to you, which is one of the hot burner issues that has landed in municipal governments across the country, but is coming soon to this one, is the as-of-right provision for homeowners to create an accessory suite within a single-family home, which recognizes that as families shrink and the needs for people, both aging population and people with mobility challenges, will increasingly want to live perhaps with an extended family and provide both a revenue source and a sharing of the cost. Talk to us about that as one of the solutions to pressure for affordable housing, because inevitably there's an NIMBY backlash to that from neighborhood associations and ratepayers groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, I think that's a way of providing a lot of gentle density. And again, if we can provide trusted, financially trustworthy opportunities for people to construct and finance those things, that's going to be valuable. But you know, that's one of many options and innovations that are kind of out there now, right? So we hear about the laneway suite kind of idea, the secondary suites. We're hearing about options for people, older adults, to share single-family dwellings.
Co-housing?
Yeah, well, co-housing is a specifically designed approach to that, whereas I'm talking about an option where, you know, it's a sort of traditional 4-bedroom home, for instance, and it's more of a roommate, if you like. And in fact, the provincial government is passing some legislation that will make that more, will remove some barriers to that, as I understand it. And unfortunately, the act is named the Golden Girls Act. I'm not kidding, actually. You hadn't heard about that? Yeah, no, it is. It really is. Yeah, no, I know. It's unbelievable, yeah. Anyways, yeah. So there's that. There's, I'm not sure if I mentioned tiny homes. Anyways, there's a number of innovations, and I think we should be encouraging all of these innovations, right? That the more that we can encourage these, then the more options there will be available. And, oh yeah, the other one is, you know, there's some models now for university students to live and provide some informal caregiving in exchange for discounted rent and so forth. All great ideas. No one of them is going to be the magic bullet. I think it's actually about providing a range of options and providing support for innovation and removal of barriers for those options to be pursued.
Great. I'm going to put one more question, and then we are going to open the floor to you. Alan, have you got the roving mic? Just so I'm... Okay, so Alan Enriquez at the back is going to come to you. You don't have to move. Just put your hand up if you'd like to put a question to either of our panelists, to the moderator, or to Mr. Wingard. Remember, the easy questions to the moderator, the hard ones to the expert. That's the way to go. So the question to you, Anju, is you've spent a good part of your career, in addition to looking at gerontology, at diversity and inclusion. What should service providers be thinking about when it comes to making sure that we are sensitive to cultural differences and all of the other things that manifest themselves in making people feel included and as a fully participating member of our community?
You have all day to talk about this? Yeah. First of all, I think I define diversity in broader terms, not just ethnicity or place of birth. So diversity in terms of sexual orientation and income and ability and all kinds of other aspects of identity. So, but if you want to focus just on some of the issues that research addressed, I think we need to have more readily accessible translation services, because language barriers lead to poor health outcomes, they lead to a lot of marginalization. So being able to access this service is very important. So the library, the public health library, has a telephone service available to people providing translation, but most people who need it don't know about it. So lack of information about what is available is huge. So I think in terms of that sense of a ready service availability to people. The other aspect of inclusion and that sense of belonging really is about doing a lot of assertive outreach. So organizations need to build trust. So in the mainstream organizations that have been around for years, they need to really go out there and spend time getting to know all these diverse communities and then finding out from them what they need and how they want that help or support. Because I think we have spent years making lots of assumptions about what people need and go ahead and develop programs. And even I've done a lot of work where I've sort of, after the fact, going, yes, we could have done this differently. So continuing to learn from the people in the community. So I think the sense of belonging really is about having opportunities to connect in a way you want to connect. So maybe for some people, it's just about having respect from their family members or being able to support their family members, and that makes them feel good and have a role with the family. But for others, it's being involved in the community. So either way, it's whatever gives people that sense of, yes, I feel like I belong here. But for me, the biggest issue probably around inclusion is about sharing of power. So far, most people are not marginalized communities. They are not at the tables where the decisions are being made. They're not the people that we go readily out to consult because it's harder work. So we tend to do easier work. The faster we can consult a group and have a meeting, a focus group, we get the people who are able to come, not the ones who are not able to come. So I think that makes for, again, this decision making that is only informed by a certain group of people. So I think we have some pretty big work to do in building relationships of trust with a lot of our marginalized communities.
Great answer. Thank you. Alan, I think we've got our first question. So I know there are no shrinking violets in this audience, and I would encourage you to wade in and to challenge us on the presentation and ask questions. One added observation before we go to the floor, and that is all of the things that you've just pointed to also, I think, are instructive in terms of democratic participation. As a lapsed former politician, I can tell you that inevitably more impoverished and more diverse neighborhoods tend to have lower voter turnout. That then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because the elected officials don't feel the same sense of accountability and immediacy to those constituencies, and as a result, they tend to get neglected when it comes to setting priorities and looking at how we create a comprehensive response to needs in communities. And we've got to think about that when we talk about access for everybody. Go ahead.
I'm interested in...
Can I ask, just if you don't mind,
Yeah.
give us your name and...
Yes. My name is Ann Pizzacella. I'm a retired nurse. I work also with the Health and Community Foundation. Very interested in aging well. I wonder if either of the panelists see opportunity with our new restructuring efforts that are moving rather rapidly, so sometimes that makes for challenges with inclusion in our healthcare system. Do you see any new opportunities there as we change things up to restructure on that level?
Great and timely question. Indeed. So the question is, relative to the new provincial restructuring around healthcare governance and administration, new provincial super agency, the abolition of the LHINs, and the desire to identify pilot communities to essentially create their own governance structure. And I'm going to put this to the two panelists, but I happen to know that Mr. Wingard is actually working with the drafting team on the proposed new local governance structure. So we'll also allow him to unburden himself to the extent he feels comfortable today. So go ahead. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll just basically say I only know little about what's happening in terms of healthcare, and I'm worried. That's all.
I'm worried too.
Yeah.
It's a huge risk. It's actually quite a staggering gamble to kind of try and wipe the slate clean and start over again is essentially the approach. But yes, to your point, certainly where there's crisis, there's opportunity at this as well. And to me, one of the biggest opportunities is thinking about the continuum the way I think about it is a continuum from institutional to residential living. So if we think about it, everything from the single detached dwelling to a hospital bed is a pairing of accommodation with support. So you're if you live in a single detached dwelling, you have accommodation, but you also have support. Someone comes and plows the snow from the road, takes the garbage away, you turn on the tap, clean water comes out. So that's a pairing of accommodation and support. Hospitals are a pairing of accommodation and support. The support just happens to be acute care support. A facility like this is a pairing of accommodation and support. A long-term care facility is a pairing of accommodation and support. Heck, jails are a pairing of accommodation and support. People literally live there. And so one of the challenges in the acute care system is people who end up in the acute care system and there's nowhere else to go for them with the right pairing of accommodation and support. And one of the groups that I work with is a new not-for-profit organization called Stillbrook Accessible Retirement Residences. And it's a not-for-profit that was started by a man named Peter Nord. He's a doctor at Providence Healthcare, and he runs a stroke clinic and a stroke rehab clinic. And so basically he sees patients who've had strokes, they go through rehab, and then it's time to discharge them. And many of them, if they are low income, often have housing that's inappropriate for them to be able to continue to live in. So they can't discharge them to the basement apartment that has 6 stairs down to it. And these are people who are eligible for LIN-based personal support worker supports and so forth, but they're low income. And they aren't able to live in a place like this because they don't have the income for it. So he said their real need is they need housing. They need housing coupled with the supports that they're already entitled to, and they're delivered in an efficient manner. So they are just getting off the ground, but he started this new not-for-profit. They have broken ground on their first building in Woodstock, and they're interested in lots of other properties around the Southern Ontario region, and they have a really great model. They can build 162 units. It houses 190 people, including units for couples, on an acre and a half of land. And early signs, I think, are that we need more and more of that. And that really is just another example of the kind of choice that we can deliver in an efficient way that gives people a high quality of life, but also fits within their means. So that would be one example.
And in that instance, they're kind of targeting moderate income.
Absolutely, yes. They're definitely targeting people who don't have many other options. Okay. And if they go to long-term care prematurely, because that's often the only place that can accommodate their needs, first of all, that's over-serving them at some level, but it also tends to accelerate people, their decline, exactly. I can see from the nursing contingent, thumbs down.
Okay.
So.
Jeff Wingard, at the risk of you telling us that you'll have to kill us after you tell us the secrets, what's going on?
So I don't have a lot of new information to share, Terry, on this, but I would say that the story for me begins in Hamilton a couple of years ago, because I think some of the acute care, the hospitals, the family health teams in Dundas, a lot of the stakeholders have recognized that the current health situation is not addressing a lot of folks well. So there were organizational silos, there were some folks that weren't getting as good a care because they didn't meet kind of the strict guidelines. And so I think you joined forces with Rob McIsaac and the Hamilton Health Sciences team to help map that out at a community level and say, well, are there things that we can do better? So I think the hope with this new legislation, I share the worry. But the hope with this new organization is that the leadership in Hamilton is as well poised as anyone to try and develop some creative partnerships and synergies that will allow the system to better address patient needs. We'll see if that bears out, but I think the intention is, and the hope is that Hamilton is well positioned. We're a good size. We have a long history of collaborating together around complicated issues. And we have a history of working on health to deal creatively with some of the challenges that it faces. So I think all of this is moving in really fast time. That's the other piece of this, that there are a number of steps underway that are taking place, but many of the major healthcare institutions are working on this and working collaboratively, which I think is good news, that we're not butting heads to try and figure out who owns this or who doesn't own this.
Right.
The
only thing I'd add to that is that the group that I'm co-chairing with Dr. David Price, and that's been working at this for the better part of 2 years, includes not insignificantly municipal government. So former city manager was at the table.
Yep.
Dr. Elizabeth Richardson's been at the table. The family health teams have been there. The children's mental health folks have been there. It very much is a recognition that the healthcare challenges of this region will not be solved within the walls of the major institutions, and their CEOs who are at the table would be the first to offer that. So like you, I am cautiously optimistic. I always worry about governments that make decisions really quickly where there isn't an obvious commitment to deliberation and engagement. So but I think we are uniquely positioned to fashion a response that understands the needs of the community and has a nuanced approach to how we do this collaboratively. I'm going to go back to the floor. Right over here, Teresa. I think we may have two over there, so one at a time.
Oh, try again.
Over the past 30 years, the inflation rate...
Can you tell us who you are, sir?
We know.
No, sorry, I was asking, can you tell us who you are before you...
My name is George Huff. I'm a retired individual. I work part-time at NAC, and I'm a member of the Hamilton Council on Aging.
Great, thank you.
My observation is this. Over the past 30 years, roughly, interest rates in Canada have been surprisingly low and very low. Those who've had pensions or been making pension investments on their own have not received the kinds of returns that earlier generations of retirees had. Is this at risk of changing the dynamic of what we currently see here, in which there is a surprisingly large group that is doing moderately well, and then the other group that's not? Because I'm concerned about what the future is going to bring for those who put 30 years into the workforce may not get out of it like their older brothers and parents did.
Yep, that's a great question. Who wants to take front end?
I think partly one of the reasons for people continuing to work later is that, right? That they don't have the returns on their savings, or they experienced the 2008 recession and had to continue working. And those in low incomes who are having to work because they don't have enough government supports and other supports. So one of the good examples, though, of where community has some responsibility also to support people who are vulnerable income-wise is that the federal government had found out that 300,000 seniors were eligible for GIS, but the guaranteed income supplement, but were not getting it because they didn't know how to apply for it, they didn't know it existed, that, all the kinds of things. And the Hamilton Council on Aging actually trained some older people to go out and find some of these folks and help them fill out the forms and apply for the benefits that they were entitled to. So I think there's way to really do that work on the ground to help people, but at the same time, I think this issue of interest rates, that's why many people are continuing to participate in the labor market. So.
Same question, Jim? Any?
Yeah, no, I'm worried about mine. That's what you're getting at, George. Message received, thanks. I think, I'm sure that the pension managers in in the affluent countries of the world are very concerned about the kinds of returns that they're going to get, and more importantly, the kinds of demands there will be on those pension funds over time. And we're certainly seeing that the next generation is increasingly moving to defined contribution as opposed to defined benefit plans and so forth. And overall, there's a dearth of good investments, if you like, right, and a lot of idle capital, and that's part of what's driving the housing market up. Is that there's, the global wealthy are looking for places to park their money, and they're parking it in the housing systems of the world, and eating up a lot of the supply and driving things up in Toronto and Vancouver, in particular in Canada. So those are definitely things to be concerned about. I don't have any solution for you, George, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and equally relevant to anybody running a foundation.
Absolutely.
Who historically have been dependent on 7 or 8% annual returns that just roll in year after year, and on a $200 million endowment, that is not insignificant in terms of what it kicks out in grants and investments. One of the things that we've done, and we spent a lot of time looking at the market conditions and projected returns going forward, is the notion for us that in addition to thinking about just pure returns in publicly traded investments, we're increasingly relying on things that we can invest in right here at home, so that you get the double impact of we're a grant maker granting $9 or $10 million a year, but we're also a very significant investor in things like affordable housing, in the arts community in Hamilton, in environmental projects like the Coutts Escarpment Eco Park, all of which are not grants. Those are things that are paying a return on capital, and at the same time doing good things in this community. And that's one of the things that we've been mindful of, trying to leverage all of our assets to the greatest extent possible for a positive benefit in Hamilton. Sorry, we had one other here. So go ahead, and then I'll come to you, Denise. Yep.
Hi, my name is Mel. I'm with St. Matthew's House, and this is pertaining to the first part where we're looking at the housing section and owners versus renters. I'm just curious, is there at any point a plan to look at the rise in homelessness among seniors, first-time shelter use, illegal evictions, morally wrong evictions, and just the impact of that on these pockets of communities that are experiencing high poverty rates?
Yeah. Everybody hear the question? No. Okay. Question was, is there a plan to deal with growing homelessness in Hamilton, particularly around the seniors population?
First time particularly too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't address a plan because I don't work for any government, but certainly this is an increasing phenomenon. And our one of our colleagues from our department, Amanda Grenier, is a specialist in this, and she's done quite a bit of research on people who've become homeless for the first time at older ages. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, I don't think it was unheard of prior to this, but it's a growing phenomenon, and it does speak to many of the issues that you're talking about. And so, some of it has to do with rent evictions, and we're seeing a lot of that in Hamilton, as this is a very rapidly inflating property market. We're seeing, it's interesting, one of the, I think when you say morally wrong, you may be referring to these cash bonuses. Yeah, well, yes. No, without a doubt, that's an issue, that the protections are insufficient under the relevant legislation. The other thing is that the tribunals are not functioning particularly well in some parts of the province. But the thing that surprised me, so I mean, my background's urban geography, and so I've followed the literature on gentrification for decades. I mean, people have been writing about gentrification since the 70s, and the thing that shocked me in Hamilton was that some of the larger landlords were actually paying people to leave. So the literature has always talked about the cases where, well, we just don't pay them, we don't respond to repair calls as quickly, or there might be kind of mild harassment, and they just try and encourage people to leave. But this is an actual cash payment, and I've heard as high as $6,000. You get $6,000 if you leave in 60 days and last month's rent. And to a lot of people who are modest income, that sounds like a heck of a lot of money. Yep. The problem is there isn't anywhere else that you can live than the unit you were staying in, where you're going to be able to find the same kind of housing at the same price. And in fact, what that the more that happens, it actually means a net decline in affordable units in the market in general because of the nature of our rent controls, which the legislation says that as long as the same tenant stays in the same unit, then the increase is only what the provincial guideline will allow. As soon as the tenant leaves, then the rent can be jacked up whatever the market will bear. And of course, that's what the investors are looking for when they try to encourage this kind of, I would call those morally wrong, because it's certainly exploitive, even though there's actual cash payment. And so without question, we should be concerned about this. And at some level, where possible, we should be encouraging people to stay where you are. Don't give up that unit. And I know that I will tell you that the city is thinking about this through that lens. Just stay. So one of the more subtle things that's happening is some landlords are getting above guideline increases. So say 3 to 4% instead of it's typically been about 1.8%. And where that's happening, one thing that we can do is we could actually, that translates into maybe $60 a month. And for a modest income household, that's actually a pretty big deal. But if we can help them with that increment and allow them to stay where they are, then we are going to keep the system more stable. And that's a really big concern. And I'm optimistic, on the one hand, that some of the work that's being done on portable housing benefits might assist with this sort of thing. That's something that's being developed at the federal level as part of the National Housing Strategy. And there was some work being done on the provincial level, but I'm not sure where that sits right now.
Yep. Okay. Go ahead, Denise. We got lots of hands. We'll get you. Just.
Denise, could you use the mic? There's people who are hard of hearing.
Yeah.
Speak close to the microphone.
Thank you very much. So Denise Christopherson, I'm the CEO of YWCA, and I contest to the comments by St. Matthew's House. We run one of the largest transitional living programs in Hamilton, and the age of women coming into our program, it continues to grow. We have more and more senior women. Also this year, there will be a report coming out about Carol Ann's Place, which was an after-hours program we ran for homeless women who, once the shelters were full, they could come there during the winter months. It's now closed, again, due to lack of funding and investment. But again, more senior women, and the numbers are staggering this year. They're continuing to grow. So I just echo, we need to find out more about that. But the other thing, I'm heartened to know that at least some local representation is talking about what healthcare is going to look at in our community. Because to be honest, many of us in the social profit sector are never called to the table and haven't been for many, many years. And yet, we've offered seniors programming in Hamilton for over 40 years. We have a lot to contribute, and yet everything we do to contribute is considered a project. So right now, there are many partners in this room who are currently working on an isolated seniors project. We only have funding until December. It's actually working. Everyone is doing amazing work. But if that project stops in December, how is that being effective?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's every single organization in this community that's social profit. We don't get to the decision-making tables. All these decisions get made, and you never ask us our opinion. So I just put that on the table. And the other thing I'm going to put on the table is healthcare needs to be discussed through a gendered lens, and that doesn't happen either. So just your comments on that. Sure. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Go ahead. Anju, why don't you start?
I'll just agree with everything Denise just said. I think that we need to really change the way we do things in terms of how we go about making decisions, and who we reach out to, who we involve. So until we begin to share that power, I don't think much is going to change. So that's the way, I guess, my bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, agree without question. And it was reflected in the figures, the last point that you made, Denise, about a gendered lens, it's reflected in the figures about income security. So overall, on an international basis, Canada does pretty well on income security, and we actually changed course pretty substantially between the 1970s and the 1990s. So Canada was a real laggard on OECD levels in terms of seniors poverty, and through sheer force of will, honestly, like political will, we went from one of the worst in the OECD to second in the OECD. We've actually slipped since then. but there's really important differences within the population, even though the rate overall. So without question, and without question, the kinds of things that you're talking about, Denise, are filling incredible gaps, and social isolation is a huge risk factor, and it has really, really strong implications for health. Studies have shown it's as great a risk factor for premature death as smoking. And so it's the kind of thing that actually lands, and the healthcare system has generally been terrible at dealing with anything that's upstream, right? They're entirely reactive as opposed to at all proactive. And I guess ideally, and that might be the opportunity that exists to try and be more proactive because it's going to be necessary.
Can I just add to something else that Denise was talking about in terms of people who are coming to your organization for help, that isolation also puts them at higher risk of abuse, right? So they are people who are being abused, and then if they have some other language barrier, some other barriers, they don't have many places to go to in this community, right? So we have lots of people who continue to exist in their current, vulnerable situations because they don't have any other place to go to. And this idea of projects, so a lot of us have lived in this community for 30-some years, I think many years for longer, that number of really great things have happened in this community over the years, and then it ends. Even though the research and the evidence showed that it was working, it was meeting an important need and many needs, and then we just say, okay, that was nice, and then we move on to something else. So yeah, that sustainability, if we need to think about it like what is actually working, then why don't we support that in a bit better way? So related to seniors, we had these workers in different low-income housing that used to be able to catch a lot of people before they ended up in emergency room. They were able to problem solve with them. It showed incredible good results. I think Margaret Dent was involved in that research, and that project just ended. Home sharing that we had going, it doesn't exist. So Stephanie is here today, one of our grad students, who's working on the Symbiosis project at McMaster, matching students from McMaster with older adults, home sharing, but it's again needs resources in order for it to go. And yet we made it to the CBC National News with that program because it's seen as a really innovative, wonderful thing, and yet we don't get the resources to run it, right? So continuing challenges.
We had a number of questions, but I'll go right into the middle, and then we'll find our way around. Go ahead, sir. Yep. Nope. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Aaron Major, Water now. I'd just like to make a comment. Jim Dunn, you gave a plug for the LRT. Just wanted to remind you that since amalgamation, we are one of the largest geographic cities. We go from Morriston in the north to I don't know how far south. So that's huge. The LRT doesn't serve a lot of people. And if it's isolation you're concerned about and transportation, you've got to look at options, not just the LRT.
Agreed.
The gentleman right next to you, Teresa, you good?
Thank you so much. My name is George Iso. I'm a retired educator. I live in Dundas. And I spend my 30-35 years with children. What I find is when we encourage that child to do something good each and every day, even if he failed in his math and English all the time, next time he will score higher. Now, I appreciate each and every one of the effort doing this life of the seniors better each and every day. But at the same time, as I'm a retired teacher, my thinking is, what can I do to make my life better? That is an important question seniors should put in their mind. Now, what I find is individual responsibility plays an important part in having a good retired life. I'm not saying it's as a universal truth. There are so many people who are going through difficult times by financial problems or physical problems or family problems. I'm not ruling them out. But at the same time, my question is, people, regardless of our age, if our mind is working, should have a determination to learn more and more every day from each and every person, regardless of how qualified or educated that person is. There is something to glean from them. Then the next one is a willingness to learn from others are very important. Then the next thing, we have to make a deliberate attempt to connect with the other people. In many cases, we think that I am the boss, I can do everything on my own. By doing that, what I find is we are isolating ourselves from the society. So as much as we can, we should get involved in different groups and share with them and talk to them, accommodate with them. My question is,
I was about to prompt you, but good.
With all this information, my question is this. Do you have any plan to motivate the seniors to get out and do things that they like to do or interact with others?
I know the Women for Change that Sherry has headed up for a few years has raised funds annually and given to a project. And this last year, they gave the money to the Hamilton Council on Aging to run workshops for older adults in the community, and they've attracted a lot of people to talk about sort of that personal responsibility, but reducing isolation and what are kinds of things they can get involved in. So I think there's momentum there. I think there's a lot more people we can reach with that, but I totally agree with you in terms of that we have a community responsibility and we have individual responsibility. At the same time, I think your comments ring very true for me about dependence, independence, and interdependence. In our Western way of thinking, we're always talking about independence, how important it is and all that. But really, we need to promote interdependence, that connection with different age groups, with different people, because that's what matters in terms of staying in the community is interdependence. So I totally agree with you on that point, that we can continue to support one another in different ways.
Can I say one more thing?
Sir,
I live in Dundas. Dundas is one of the beautiful places in Hamilton City. Thank you.
a paid commercial advertisement for Dundas. Well done. I'm going to take perhaps 3 more, and then what I can promise you is that the panelists have agreed to stick around. They're happy to answer your questions one-on-one, and we're going to have some refreshments and some more food. So, who's been waiting the longest? Fire away.
Somebody has a name. My name is Harriet Woodside. I chair a wonderful group right here in Dundas that offers programs for people over 55, and we have always filled up. And one of the challenges for a group like ours is that we want to reach out to the isolated seniors, the very group many of us have talked about. When my mother was living in a residence like this, she said to me one day, you know, there are 2 kinds of people here. There are the people we see and there are the people we don't. And it's that people we don't see that interests me. So my question is, what is the definition of an isolated senior? And are there any tips on how to locate these people?
Yes. That's a great question.
All right, Renee, you can answer.
Well, I was going to turn it over to Tanya, our seniors isolation worker. She can tell you.
Yeah.
It's a whole index.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Go ahead, explain.
Aren't you glad that you came so that we could put you on the spot without...
Tell us what you do.
Well then, it's a little nervous, but I think isolation just looks different across the board. I think a lot of people just automatically think that the senior is lonely, but isolation is like that. You're lacking that connection. So whether it's to your community, whether it's to health supports, day programs, social, it's just, you just lack that connection, and a lot of it comes from the lack of awareness. You don't know what's out there and available, and I'm the senior isolation worker working with St. Matthew's House, and a lot of my seniors, I think sometimes they might feel embarrassed that at this age they don't know who to connect to or they don't know who to ask the questions to. A lot are assume that they have the supports that they need or they're managing okay, and they're definitely not. So I think, I can't remember your name, sorry.
It's Harriet.
Harriet, but just looking around you, like your neighborhood, asking seniors if they're okay, if they need any help. I get a lot of my referrals from city housing landlords who notice that tenants don't really leave their homes, or they go in to do inspections and they realize, you know, there's hoarding, there's lack of food, they need health supports, hospitals, things like that. So there's seniors everywhere. It's just that we have to not assume that, you know, they've worked all this time, so now they're taken care of through whatever pensions they have or family. So yeah, it's that interdependent thing. We all need to be looking out for each other in our community, because that's essentially what a community is.
Thanks so much. If you just hand that microphone, we'll take two there and then one other from. Go ahead.
Next door and then behind.
Can I ask you to?
Then behind you.
But let's try and get directly to the question if we can.
So my name's Christine. I'm with St. Matthew's House. My question is, do you guys have any suggestions that you would recommend for either like the community, the city as a whole, or just agency providers to like target isolated seniors? Because I think just going off of what Tanya and the Y was saying, like a lot of them, our program is only funded until October, and then the other programs until December. So I think a lot of it too is that clients also go back into isolation and are hesitant to receive support when they know that something that they're getting is going to be ending relatively shortly. So any suggestions that you guys have?
I can, all the hard ones. I've never worked this hard in a long time. Okay. I think that's, okay. In terms of how people sustain in the community, to me, this idea of feeling valued and being able to contribute are really important, right? So even the most vulnerable somehow still have that need for belonging and for feeling like they still have something to give, okay? And so I think we have, that's why that notion of interdependency is so important, is that, so finding ways for them to connect with other people who might be in similar circumstances or different circumstances, or even connecting them to students, to other people, that they can feel that support and being valued. So it may not change their circumstances financially, but still feeling like they have some connection, right? So I think that to me is probably more important for the longer term, because these projects and these funding things will come and go, right? So that building that trust. So I do a lot of work in case management directly with case managers, and I keep telling them about vulnerable seniors that it all has to start with just building trust and just getting to know them and their circumstance, and not judging them in ways that we tend to do. So,
and let me add something, and it's not specific to the funding or security of the program you're running, but more broadly, the one change that I have witnessed as a passenger watching the unfolding debate about the future of health and social services in this community is that for the first time, the big players that have wielded the big stick are no longer exclusively hospital CEOs, because historically they've had the front row seat at the table. They've tended to have an inordinate amount of pull on the provincial treasury, and I've seen in particular the leadership from the city of Hamilton say, the stuff we do on food security, on homelessness, on supportive housing is every bit as important on health promotion to the well-being of the community and to what we're paying collectively to support the needs of people who live here. And that's a change dynamic that I have not witnessed in 30 years in and around the public sector. The power is shifting, and in my opinion, it is not a day too soon. Now, where we land on that obviously is dependent on thoughtful intervention and support from senior levels of government as well as the municipal government. But those voices are being, the social service, social welfare side of this is being heard more clearly and strongly and forcefully than I've ever seen it. We're going to go to Margaret Denton, and then we're going to come back here for a final question. I hope it's a good one, no pressure. Go ahead, Margaret.
I got a good question, a big question for you, which is, when you asked a question, Terry, about ageism. When I think of ageism, I think of it as being three different components. The first one, is stereotyping. We stereotype older people, and older people stereotype themselves. Second component is prejudice. A third component is discrimination. So my big question is, what can we do as a community to reduce ageism in Hamilton? It's just a big question I'm putting out there.
Okay, so inside information. Margaret is a colleague from our department who's been retired, and as I saw her hand go up, I'm quaking. I'm thinking, what could I possibly say that Margaret doesn't already know about this topic? And that question remains in my mind. So, Anju, over to you.
Oh dear. I think probably one thing about ageism, it's like any of the other isms. These biases develop at a very young age, right? So talking to children about how they think about aging in older people is very important, because that's the same with how they think about people with disabilities or how they think of people of a different race, right? So all these isms, we have to address them at an early age so that those biases are dealt with. But at current situation, I would say continue to have very diverse role models. Positive role models is one really important thing, but also creating more intergenerational opportunities. And challenge people when they use ageist language, when they make these sort of offhand comments, which they think are funny. So continue to challenge those is very important, because we need to break that cycle and continue to talk about that it is an issue that impacts people. Why do so many older people talk about being invisible, that they felt like they're invisible? It's because of the ageism, right? And it's not just ageism discrimination, I think, at an individual level or in organizations. I think there's a lot of ageism in our policies and in our practices where we literally marginalize older people. So I think we have to keep challenging the media on it, because they use it as a free way of giving their message that somehow older people are a problem. So we need to keep challenging them as well. So that's
on that front, my segue is Jim Dunn and I co-authored a series of Hamilton Spec op-eds around the future of the community a couple of years ago. And again, unconscious bias at some point referred to the tsunami coming of aging population. And the first phone call I had was to tune me up.
That was the spec.
You'll notice that I haven't used that kind of language since. And
that was the spec who did that.
It was indeed.
It was an editorial thing.
And our last question, please. Take the mic if you don't mind, so we can all hear you.
My name is Mary Bazell, and
Hi,
I'm
Mary.
a retired nurse living here.
You got a home court advantage.
Right. I cared for our mother for 8 years, one of the heaviest care in my whole career. And I loved her, and so did the family, but we wore out.
Yeah.
And I'm looking now at many long-term care beds closed or not open, or a huge waiting list, and people absolutely unable to cope. Do you think we're going to have abandonment of caregivers?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mary, for that question. So Mary is a long-term mentor of mine, so I'm glad she's here. In terms of that question, I think I don't think we would have abandonment. I think we already are abandoning some of our caregivers. We've already left many to suffer for way too long without giving adequate support. So at the same time, I think what we're seeing, some of the current media, and they're covering, you know, where family members just can't cope anymore and someone took their mother and left them at the emergency. I think if we don't address this issue in a bigger way, systematic way, we're going to see more of that. But in terms of cognitive impairment in particular, that struggles family members are facing and not getting the supports that they need. So I think, yes, we need to address this. I'm not sure we will abandon the cause, because at national level there's some things happening as well, but I do think that, yes, there's a huge unmet need there.
Right. Yeah, and in fairness too, while it's certainly a need, it's one that's been at least nominally acknowledged through some policy initiatives in terms of giving people the opportunity to take leave without from their employment so that they can engage in caregiving activities and so forth. So I think there's at least some recognition for the issue, but you know, is our work done? By no means, and it's only going to be an even more acute problem, I would suggest, going forward. So great question, thank you.
I just want to add to that, though, just back to the inclusion issue. I would say most of our caregiving programming and supports don't really address the issue of some of our marginalized communities and how they want things and what kind of supports they want. It's still very mainstream approach to dealing with these things. So.
If you don't have a home, it's hard to take on the support.
Yeah, exactly.
What did she say? She said if you don't have a home to come to, it's hard to take on the support of a PSW or something like that. Or if you have a home that's inaccessible, or if you have a home that's full of bed bugs or whatever, right? And that's the hard line, I think, that we're missing, right? You and I had a chat about that, and it's a long time coming that we still haven't seen us break that barrier.
And on that note, good closing bookend. Thank you.